Hi. So this is Module 6. We are actually nearing the end of the course, believe it or not, but still with a lot of content left to cover. Module 6 covers a lot of content. It covers all of quantitative design, which is pretty much experimental design. So the first thing that I want to say is that there are a number of very important concepts and key terms that I just want to draw your attention to because I'm not going to cover them in this mini lecture, but want to make sure that as you're doing your readings that you pay extra close attention to a couple of really key concepts to understanding kind of quantitative research design. So the first is the difference between causality and correlation. We've talked a little bit about this earlier, but really important to understand that two things being correlated with one another does not mean that one thing causes the other to occur. This is important in the context of this module because whether you are trying to prove correlation or whether you are trying to actually prove causality makes a big difference in terms of the type of quantitative design that you choose. There is a TED Talk that is a part of this module that you'll watch that's specifically about the difference between causality and correlation in a way that I think will be enjoyable and fun for you to learn about. She takes a really humorous approach to the difference. So please pay attention both to that TED Talk and then that discussion in your chapter. And so that's the first thing. Then the other two key concepts that I'm not going to cover in this mini lecture that I want you to pay attention to, one is internal validity. We've talked about validity and reliability before, and now we're introducing two additional types of validity, and important to understand how they're different than what we've talked about before. Internal validity and the threats to internal validity are covered in 6 or 7 pages in your chapter. So make sure you really understand the concept of internal validity, which again, like validity is, it's about does this study actually measure what we say that it's going to measure, and those threats to internal validity. So pay attention to that section in your chapter. And then external validity and what that means. External validity actually has to do with whether the study is designed in a way that's valid enough to generalize it to kind of the larger population. I'm not going to say too much about that just for the sake of time on the mini lecture, but please pay attention to that in your chapter. What I do want to talk about briefly in this presentation is experimental design. And we're actually going to talk about experimental design as a continuum. So this first slide is really important because the far end of that continuum is true experimental design. We've already talked about causation, and true experimental design is the type of design that you would have to choose if you're trying to prove causality. If you're trying to prove that X causes Y, you can only do that with a true experimental design. It controls for threats to all internal validity. And in addition to that, for something to be considered true experimental design, 6 conditions must be satisfied. And so on this slide, you'll see the 6 conditions for true experimental design. Time order, manipulation of the independent variable, relationship, so correlation has to be established. And then you control for rival hypotheses. You must have a control group, and you must have randomization. And we'll talk as we talk through the continuum that the presence of a control group and random assignment are the 2 characteristics that are usually missing from things in quasi-experimental design. All right, the other thing that we need to talk about before we launch into the different types of designs is understanding kind of experimental shorthand. This is really important because if you understand this, then you can look at all of those things that you see in the chapter that actually look very complicated because it's all X's and O's and R's. What does that mean? On a very basic level, what we need to remember is X stands for intervention, O stands for observation or data collection, and R indicates that randomization has occurred. That'll be important as we kind of look at the different designs moving forward. Okay, so if we think about experimental design on a continuum, one end of that continuum is pre-experimental design. And pre-experimental design is exploratory research. Exploratory research, remember, exploratory research a lot of times is qualitative research. Doesn't have to be, but a lot of times is qualitative research. So pre-experimental design is not meeting those 6 criteria at all, because it really is just about kind of exploring research questions that are out there. So it has low internal validity, but as we've talked about kind of in thinking through that continuum, sometimes that's okay. So you see over in the corner some examples of those X's and O's. And what's probably most important is to see the absence of an R. Right? So if you look at those different designs over there, there's no R, there's no randomization, and that's because it's not a true experimental design. There's also not really a control group, and so that's one thing that you'll see as the difference. So anytime that you see X and O sort of things, if there's no R, you know it has to be at least on the quasi-experimental or pre-experimental design section of the continuum. All right, so then if that's exploratory research, then descriptive research, that stuff in the middle of the continuum that we've talked about, is what's called quasi-experimental design. Quasi-experimental design, usually trying to get at correlation, but not causality. It usually lacks, like I said, a control group and randomization. And so you'll look in your book at some examples of that quasi-experimental design. So then if we move farther on the continuum, remember again the 6 criteria that must be established for true experimental design. Time order, independent variable must be manipulated. You prove some sort of relationship or correlation. You control for any rival hypotheses. You add a control group and randomization. And you get experimental design. Your book talks about a number of different experimental design options, and they're kind of listed here. And so what's important is that you can talk yourself through any of these R, X, and O's scenarios. R, randomization. X, intervention. O, observation. So for example, in that pre-test, post-test control group design, the way you would read that is, what that tells you is there's 2 different groups. The first line, so people are randomized into 2 different groups. That's what the R tells you. And then group 1 has an observation point, a pre-test, then some sort of intervention, and then a post-test. While group 2 just gets the pre-test and the post-test with no intervention. That makes sense, right? Then that's what allows you to answer the question, did that intervention make a difference? And so that's how you can kind of tell the difference in experimental design, is at least 2 lines, which tells you there's a control group, and randomization. And you can see they get more sophisticated as you go along. The most sophisticated type of experimental design is a Solomon 4 group, which you can see over at the end of this slide. And that is that there's 4 groups. You can see that with the 4 lines. People randomized into those 4 groups, so everyone has an equal opportunity of being chosen. Sometimes we're even using matched pairs in those scenarios, which really ensures that the exact same types of people are in each group. They're randomized, and then some people get a pre-test and an intervention and a post-test. Some people just get pre-test, post-test. Some people just get an intervention and a post-test. Some people just get a post-test. And it just gives you an opportunity to kind of compare in 4 different groups to see what the difference are. It's the most sophisticated. So what do we need to take away from this? You need to take away that there's lots of different design choices that you can make, and you're going to start thinking then about how you would design your proposed study based on that continuum. And so that continuum, then here's our completed continuum. We're totally done with those last pieces fit in. So you can see pre-experimental design, quasi-experimental design, and experimental design with correlation and causality figured in. So what you're doing now is finishing up the last of your proposed methodology. Again, paying close attention to this continuum and making sure that your proposed project makes sense all along the way. So look at your aims, look at your questions, and then look at the design choices that you make. That is a very brief overview of the experimental design continuum. And so please now turn back to your textbook and really delve in and make sure that you understand those concepts before you take the quiz. All right. Good luck.